Welcome to the Anchored Podcast. Have you ever wondered how to stay grounded in your faith amid heartache, confusion, and a seemingly mass exodus of people leaving the faith? My name is Roseanne Dawes.
And I'm Stephanie Frankham. And we've discovered that being anchored in Jesus Christ is the key to navigating these rough waters. Join us as we explore how their faith and covenants have helped each of our guests navigate the storms of life.
Hello, and welcome to our Anchored Podcast.
We are so glad that you are here for another episode where you will learn how Bethany has stayed anchored in Jesus Christ.
And we just wanted to share that all three of us got to know each other in the Rare Faith community. And I just have to tell you, I was in a 1-year program with Bethany, and this was a program that there was a lot of vulnerability. There was a lot of challenges. There was a lot of bringing things up to see what Rare Faith was all about in our own personal stories and in our own personal lives. And listening to Bethany every week just was so inspiring because her faith is strong and she wants to do what the Lord is asking her to do. Like, that is her number one priority. And to just week after week listen to her stories and know that she is studying and learning and trying to stay close to her Savior. And she's taught me so much, even about the scriptures. There's a couple scriptures that come to mind about, you're talking about Peter on the water and getting out of the boat, and and an insight with that, and also with Job, and because there's challenges there, but learning different insights. And she's so willing to share. And today we're so grateful that she's here willing to share her story. But first, Bethany, introduce yourself. Give us a little recap of who you are and what you're all about.
All right. Well, thank you for letting me be here today and sharing my stories. It's been a little bit of a stretch to share more publicly versus in those smaller classes. It was a little bit easier to be more vulnerable, but I was born and raised in Phoenix, Arizona. I lived there the majority of my life. I did live overseas briefly. I lived in Saudi Arabia as a child, and I served a mission for the church in Chicago, Spanish speaking. So I loved it there. I loved my mission, and when I went home, I went never live in the Midwest again. Like, the weather was awful. It was too cold. It was too hot. It was too humid. I was never going to live in the Midwest. But never say never, because I currently am in a little tiny town in Southwest Iowa. So I am back in the Midwest, and I've been here about 4.5 years now. I was born and raised in the church. Both of my parents come from Pioneer heritage. It's a little fun to be living where I am. My temple is the Winter Quarters Temple, and I have a little claim to fame there because Hosea Stout is featured in one of the things through the Trail Center, which is the visitor center there. They have his quote that comes up, and that is one of my ancestors. And then also Stillman Pond is a big, well-known name through there, and that's one of them is my mom's side and one of them is my dad's side. So that I have like this little, like, I'm like famous when they find out when I'm over at the Winter Quarters Visitor Center. So that's kind of fun. But I love living here. I've been divorced twice. That being born and raised in the church was not ever going to be something that I went through. But I have 4 children. My oldest is a son, and then I have 3 daughters. Their ages 24, 23, 18, and then an 8-year-old. And my oldest daughter just got married, so now I have a son-in-law. And I am remarried for the 3rd time, and 3rd time's a charm. Very happily married, and we've been married a little over a year now.
That is beautiful. And you are just right in the middle of starting a foundation, which
Yes.
is, yeah, you want to tell us just a little bit about that before we get started on your story?
Yeah. So in my previous life, I was a veterinary nurse, and I did almost 10 years of emergency and critical care after many years in day practice. And then I went on to get my accounting degree, and I was super excited about that. And COVID changed up those plans somewhat, which is what pushed me into the personal development world as a participant. And then I was hooked and became a facilitator for Rare Faith, which is where the 3 of us met. And have both continued to participate in programs and facilitated those programs, which has led to, in the last few months, I've been feeling frustrated because my service continues to be a non-paid service a lot of the time, and that led to the thought of a nonprofit. And so Leslie and I are in the process, and it actually just officially launched, the Breakthrough Foundation. We are so excited about it because just in a few conversations here and there, not even soliciting anything, people are coming out and saying, we would love to donate to this. We would love to support other people in their transformations. And so now I can see why I needed to stay in kind of the servitude and not creating the income that I wanted. And it's because the people that I'm here to serve, they get to be financed through the generous donations of others.
It is so exciting, and we are excited to watch where this takes you. Just one clarification is when you mentioned Leslie, she's talking about Leslie Householder, who runs Rare Faith, and it's mindset and being able to see those things that really matter in your life, especially anchored in Jesus Christ, to see those things happen. So we are so excited for the two of you working together to do that. So let's just go ahead and you can jump in, and we are so excited to hear your story.
Okay. I know one of the questions that, I've been thinking of when Roseanne sent some things to ponder are ways that I've relied on my covenants to anchor myself in Christ, and as I've navigated the challenges in my life. And I think I do a really good job of that now, and I'm intentional about it, but it didn't start that way. So having been raised in the church, I was raised in the best way that my parents knew how, which was the typical old church culture, where it was the letter of the law, is how the expectations in my home were the letter of the law. And I didn't feel like that was a problem because I didn't have a problem living the letter of the law. It did create a lot of guilt and shame as I became an adult for things that I shouldn't have been feeling guilt or shame for, because it just wasn't necessary. They're just part of being human. Specifically, my depression and anxiety that continued to get worse. I was married shortly after getting home from my mission. So I was married in 1999, and just a year later, I had my first, not quite a year later. And so I had my first son, he's my only son, but my first child was born in 2000 and May of 2000. And then in June of 2001, I had my daughter, the first of my children, the first of my three girls. And 4 months after that, I lost my mom. She had not been super healthy, but the death was rather unexpected. It came very quickly. It sent my husband, he had a really hard time with my mom's death. And from about the end of 2001, beginning of 2002, with the loss of her, losing my mom, and that kind of pushed my husband back into some previous addictions that he had. I began to even say that I was surviving would have been a stretch. I was existing. It was just diapers and crying and just trying to hold on. That lasted until about 2013. Maybe more like 2012. I did have my third in between there. And in those years, I lost multiple children. I had early pregnancy loss multiple times. We weren't sure that we would be able to have a third. We ended up seeing a doctor, and I was able to have my third. And so, but it was within this that I was still just kindly going through the daily motions of life. And the best I could do, and I don't feel like if I look back, I don't feel like I was intentionally saying I'm going to keep my covenants. But the best that I had was allowing myself to wake up the next day. I didn't want to. That was the most I had to give as far as being a covenant keeping woman, was allowing myself to get up the next day, each day. And I can see how there's behaviors on the part of my husband that led to my depression, and how my depression led to a lot of his behaviors. It was just this vicious cycle. And ultimately that marriage ended in divorce, which blindsided me. He left us to live with a woman that was living across the street from us. And so, having been active members of the church where he was the Sunday school president in our ward, and we attended every week, and we went to the temple every week, or regularly, not every week, but that was a really hard blow. I knew of some struggles that my husband had, but my children didn't. So now I'm trying to help them understand things that were very foreign to them, and the dynamics within a ward when there was so much. And after the divorce, I had to enter into this scary, crazy world of single parenting. And I realized from there, I had to step up. At this point, if my children lost me, it would mean that they would end up in a situation that I knew they weren't going to be able to progress spiritually if they were left with the other party. I was really concerned about that. So I went from just allowing myself to wake up to, I kind of leveled up in my commitments, and scripture study and prayer were really important. I wasn't always able to attend church because of my work schedule, trying to support my 3 young children on my own. And I had an angel of a sister who would come over. She had a Monday through Friday job, and when she went to work on Fridays, she would pack up her car for the weekend, and she would come to my house by Friday evening and spend the weekend, so that my children had a parent figure in the house. Even though I was working most of the time, she took my kids to church if I wasn't able to. And then when she had to be at work at 6 o'clock in the morning on Monday, she would leave at 4:30 a.m. from my house and drive to church to work. And she did that for about a year. So she really was my children's other parent, and like my mom. And so I could see myself growing. Like, as I don't know that I saw it at the time, but as I look back, I can see where my commitments to my covenants were growing. And it's the simple covenants, like the baptismal covenants. We're not even talking the higher level covenants. It's the baptismal covenants where, I go to church and I have faith. Those were the things that I was starting to do better and more intentionally. And I was remarried in 2015. So at this time I was 40 years old, and I had been told I couldn't have more children. And between multiple pregnancy losses before and after my third, I was pregnant right away at 40 years old with my second husband. And we had both wanted to have a baby. He had not had children before. And it was still a surprise. I mean, I was shocked. And I was so sick. I did not have hard pregnancies with my first 3, but the 10-year difference in age was a doozy. And I was sick every single day. And there was a lot about that marriage that was really, really healing for me. He took such good care of me when I was pregnant. My kids all got walking pneumonia while I was pregnant, which was really hard. My anxiety had shot through the roof, and I was struggling, and ended up in a pretty massive panic attack in the ER. In fact, it was determined that it was a panic attack, but I had lost my vision temporarily. And so when you're pregnant, the fear is a high blood pressure issue. And it wasn't any of it. It was an anxiety attack. And the doctor said, you either need to slow down or you're going to lose your baby from the anxiety. And so at that point, we moved in with my sister. So we moved my family of 5, about to be 6, into her little 1,200 square foot home. It was tough. It was really tight, but it was such a blessing, because 2 weeks after moving in, I had emergency abdominal surgery. I was 21 weeks along. So I had been sick all the time, and so I just kept getting anti-nausea medications, but my gallbladder was failing. And so I ended up, they sent me straight to labor and delivery because I was past 20 weeks instead of going through the ER. But my gallbladder was 100% blocked and leaking. So I had to go into surgery. And that was terrifying because you don't know what's going to happen to the baby. And I can remember that the last words that I heard before I was anesthetized, they had come in to, I could feel the baby moving. They were having a hard time tracking her heart rate. So a second nurse had come in, and I overheard them talking as I was going to sleep. And one nurse said, "Will there be a nurse to monitor the baby during the surgery?" And the other nurse said, "No, the baby's not viable. We'll just check when she comes out." So the last thing that I heard before going to sleep for surgery was, "It is what it is." And so I can remember in that very split second imagining that angels kept my baby's heart beating. Would be fine, and the surgery, it couldn't have gone better. And I was in and out within minutes. He was shocked at how easy the surgery was. He didn't know at the time if it would be laparoscopic or if he would have to open me completely because of how big the baby would be or how easy it would be to get to everything. And it was super simple, the actual surgery. However, recovering from abdominal surgery with little feet on the inside, pushing on those incisions was not the most pleasant experience I've ever had. So I continued to be pretty sick throughout the pregnancy, but we were blessed. Just before I turned 41, I had my fourth. And she was such a healing piece of our family because we all loved her. She was a place that connected all of us, and there was never any emotions or thoughts of her being a half sibling. Like that was just never a thing. Throughout this time I was going to school, I had gone back to school to get my accounting degree. But shortly after the baby was born, my husband's mental illness began escalating. And it was slowly at first. But this marriage that had been very healing for me began to turn abusive. It was verbal and emotional abuse. And I do believe that a lot of it in the beginning was uncontrolled. I don't know how much of it in the end. He did the very best that he could with the amount of mental illness that he struggles with on a daily basis. In an effort to save the marriage, and there's a whole story behind it, but we ended up moving to Iowa, which is where he's from. So that's what brought us here. His mom and I had become really, really close. She's one of my best friends. And Riley, my littlest, is the only natural born grandchild. And so she just enveloped all four of my kids as her own grandkids. And she doesn't see any of them as any different. And so I had my two oldest kids by this point had moved out. They were adults and living on their own. But I moved to Iowa with my 14-year-old and my 4-year-old. And the thought was that it would save my marriage, that having my mother-in-law close would be able to help when he was struggling. That wasn't the case. And less than 4 months after we had moved to Iowa, we permanently separated physically. We had a physical separation, and that was the last time that we had some separations before, but this was the final one, and it was going to be a permanent separation. It was not going to be permanent separation. It ended up being permanent, but there was still some hope that with enough time and distance that we could still repair some of the relationship. But by the end of 2021, I had made the decision to file for divorce, and that left me with trying to understand and do what was best for my 5-year-old. Still wanting her to have a relationship with her father, but knowing that he wasn't actually mentally capable of managing the emotional support that goes along with child raising. I didn't have any concerns with the physical. There was never any physical abuse. But I was very concerned for the emotional well-being. So when I filed for divorce, I was filing for sole custody so that I could make sure that her well-being was taken care of. And that led to a custody dispute throughout the entire litigation. And about this time also, we had become homeless. There was a lot of housing situations that we were dealing with during the time that we were in Iowa. And we laugh when I say we, my oldest daughter and I, the joke is that we were homeless but not roofless. And this was about the time that the three of us connected, which was in the class. And I'm sure you guys probably remember me sitting cross-legged on the bottom of the bunk, and you could see in our meetings, you could see the slats above my head because I shared twin bunk beds with my 16-year-old. So the one was 16 by this point, and the little was 6. I shared the twin size bottom bed with my 6-year-old, and the 16-year-old got the top bunk. And those were some hard days because I was living with my mother-in-law while I was divorcing her son, and it was about 900 square feet of space that we were sharing together with one bathroom. So not many people can say that they can live with their mother-in-law and never have an argument, let alone get along. And we did. We got along great. There were moments that we all kind of went to our separate corners so that there was not contention. But we all handled it really, really well. And she really is, she's an angel. She has continued to be an advocate and support for us. But during this time, and it again took me by surprise, my ex-husband in Arizona had become upset that my daughter was living in Iowa. There's some reasons behind it. It really wasn't so much about the wanting to be with her, but out of the blue, I was thrown into another custody litigation and fighting for her. It wasn't for her. It wasn't like I needed her to live with me. But she made it very clear that she couldn't live with her dad. And again, there wasn't abuse. There was other situations, but she'd made it clear that if she lived with her dad, she would end her life. And so it was a fight for her life. It had nothing to do with the custody per se, but truly fighting for her life. And so in all of 2022, like from the beginning to the end, I was in 2 custody disputes with 2 men in 2 states. I had to hire 2 different attorneys fighting for 2 different children for their well-being and the safety. And there was a huge character attack, and it would come from both parties. And so it was really hard to not see myself as they were portraying me. And at that point, there's always a choice. Obviously, there's always a choice. But the choice that I was making was I felt like I couldn't choose to not hold on to my covenants. And I felt like that was the only, when everything else felt completely everything was out of control for me. The fate of my children was sitting in the courtrooms. Like it didn't matter what I felt was best for them. Like the only thing that I had to do was present a case and hope that a judge could see that this was in their best interest. It didn't matter what I was doing. My housing world was in complete chaos because we couldn't find housing that would suit us in the community that we were at. And it felt a little silly we couldn't move far away because I didn't have family unless we went back to Arizona. And then that was what I was trying to fight for, was what was best for my kids and where we were at. And so nothing felt like I felt like I had no control. And so the only thing that I could do was I had started attending the temple every week. And that was a huge sacrifice of time. It's an hour for me to get to the temple from where I'm at. I didn't have substantial regular income. But I felt like I went to the temple on Wednesdays, and if I could get to the temple on Wednesday and then make it to Sunday to go and take the sacrament, it was like I only had a few days of like managing on my own in between. And so that was how that's how I feel at this point. I still felt like I was just surviving. I was more than existing. I had a purpose. I had things that I was working towards. At this point, I'm a rare faith facilitator. I had gone from being a program participant to teaching it. And it's not easy to sit in classes as a facilitator or as what's considered a leader and teach about dream creation and how our words create our world. And we get to choose the life that we live when I felt like I had no choices anymore. Those choices has been taken from me, and everything I was working towards, you know, was lost, is what it felt like.
Bethany, I
Yes.
would love to hear, how was going to the temple and partaking of the sacrament, how was that a lifeline? I mean, as far as leaning into those covenants and so forth, how did that affect you during that time, and why?
During that time, it was hope. It was hope that the promises that had been given to me would be fulfilled, because that wasn't what I wasn't seeing it in my physical world. Um, the lifeline was simply hope. I didn't really know if that was going to matter. I did believe that if it didn't turn out like I wanted here, I had developed enough faith and understanding of the atonement that eventually, okay, but the here in this world, here in this life, it would still be okay for my children and I. So at that point, it was, I'm trying to get into the space of where I was then. It was just the lifeline of hope. It was hoping that the promises that we've been told by the prophets in the scriptures and those covenants, that that was truly going to take place. It's what kept, it's the only thing I could control. I could control that level of hope. I could control that there was faith in those promises. Does that answer it? So
Yes, I was actually thinking that from our last episode, we talked about the nethermost parts of the vineyard, and that's what I was thinking was you were working in the part of the vineyard that you had control over so that God could take care of the things that you couldn't. And I love that increase of faith that comes when we are participating in temple ordinances, that it strengthens our belief that he will keep his promises. I love that.
it's funny that you talked about the nethermost parts of the vineyard. Oh, that comes in at the end of this. So yeah, so I was at this. So if you fast forward a little bit, I was no longer just attending the temple every week, but I was going all the time anyway. So they asked me to be an ordinance worker. So now I was going, and that just brought a whole different level. The immediate blessings that came shortly after being set apart as an ordinance worker, I actually should back up a little. I didn't think that they would take me as an ordinance worker. They had extended the offer to come in, and I was meeting with the temple president, and I knew that I needed to be honest about my situation, but I'm like, they're never going to let me be an ordinance worker. Like, they don't typically have single women that have the full responsibility of children on their plate, because of, the time that you're in the temple and you're not really connected to the outside world. And so I was like, maybe I should not tell them everything, and then they'll still let me have this calling. But I laid it all. I laid it all out. And I remember pausing, and I was thinking, please don't deny me. Please don't deny me. And he paused and he looked down, and then when he looked back up and he said, Sister Thulin, I'd like to call you to be an ordinance worker in the Winter Quarters Temple in Nebraska, like the Nebraska Winter Quarters Temple. And he said, and I want you to know that this calling is coming straight from the Savior, because he wants you to be here. And the Spirit was so strong. And he set me apart. And within, I think it was 10 days, I was not going to trial with for my divorce case, and I received full physical and legal custody. I got everything that I needed, and there was no DCFS involvement. She never had to go through the trauma of that. And I've since been told that that's unheard of. It doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen here. And so that case was resolved. And we were living in our own home by this point. It was gross. It wasn't the best home, but it was ours and we loved it and we were so happy that we had it. But I was still moving forward with the trial in Arizona with my older daughter. And so in the summer of last year, I was actually going to Arizona for trial. When the week before, there was a report that came out from the court-appointed advisor, who she had been appointed by the court. It's a forensic psychologist that she does interviews and she reviews the whole thing and then makes recommendations to the court. And when that came out, it corroborated everything that I had said. The suggestion to the court was that all visits ceased immediately, and it even suggested that dad should receive some intervention, and that he just couldn't understand the mental health of our daughter. And so at that point, the litigation ended. I received a fairly sizable settlement in the process, which would help with the attorney fees. It really didn't touch the amount of the financial implication of that entire ordeal. It didn't really even touch it. But it felt good to kind of come out victorious in the end. And I didn't care about victorious for me, but I felt like it was like somebody removed the shackles. Like I was free and my children were free. And it was, it's hard to put into words. But again, I've heard the same thing. This doesn't happen. Like, I don't know how you got this. Even my attorney said, I have never seen a judge write orders in this manner. I've never seen it in all my years of practice. And so I had this physical evidence of what happens. And I do believe that it was because I sacrificed a lot of time. I sacrificed a lot of, money in gas to go to the temple, things that I could have done otherwise, but that's what I felt like I had to give so that I could expect, the prophet says to seek and expect miracles, but I do feel like I needed to put forth my effort. And that was me putting forth the effort and then receiving the miracle that I really didn't have control over. The miracle was left in somebody else's hand. It was just all that I was doing to try and hold on to my covenants during that time. And this all sounds fantastic, and it actually really was. But I was, by the time this litigation had ended, I was exhausted. I was spiritually, financially, emotionally, every which way you can think of. I was depleted. I was drained. I didn't want to go on. I mean, which seems silly because here I had, I had gotten all of these miracles, but I was so tired of doing it alone. And I have my own mental health struggles. I have severe depression and anxiety that has plagued me most of my life. And it's only been recently that I feel like I am actually on top of that. And I have moments of it versus it being most of my life. It's just moments anymore. But I was tired. And I had received a blessing earlier that year. And in the blessing, this gentleman he actually didn't know me because I was visiting a friend at the time out of state. But in the blessing, he told me that that I was not to give up on my dreams of marriage, and everything that I had been wanting was on its way. And I was pretty mad because I didn't want to date. And the mid LDS singles world is kind of a mess. It's a little scary out there. And I didn't have time. I didn't want to deal with having to weed and date. I didn't want to. But about the time that I had filed for divorce, so this was a year and a half or so or more before, I had written a relationship vision. I had used some of the things that between my faith and the things that I was teaching in Rare Faith, I had written a vision of all the things that I wanted in a marriage. So when this man gave me this blessing and he says, all the things that you've been wanting, I had it written. Like, he didn't know that I had it written, but it had been written. And one of the things that we teach when you're in goal setting in Leslie Householder's programs is to set a date, and then you just kind of let it go. So, you know, those years before, I had wrote July 30th, 2023, because I put it far enough out. So this was written in 2021. I put it far enough out that it could, you know, felt like it would be doable, but not so far out that it would just never come. So it was just a random date that I threw out there, July 30th, 2023. And I started with, I am so happy and grateful that I am in a healthy marriage relationship. And then I went on to list all the things, experiences that I, you know, wanted to have. And so that was just kind of sitting on the back burner. But by the time I get here, it's, you know, my litigation has ended. I'm exhausted. And I actually I had been dating. It's just not fun. Dating is not fun. I was never a dater. I dated my husband and got married, and then we got divorced, and then I went on a couple of dates, and then I get married on this. I just wasn't a dater. It just wasn't a thing for me. And I'm like, I just don't want to. And I was really angry. I didn't want to hold on to this dream of marriage. And I got really, really angry one day, and I wrote this huge hate-filled letter to God. So this is I do a lot of journaling where I just write straight to my Heavenly Father. And this time I was just angry at him, and I was exhausted. I didn't want to do it. And so I wrote this whole letter, and then I burned it. And I remember as I burned it and I took this big breath, and I heard the words, "Even if you see me as that way, are you still willing to serve me?" And I went to bed, and I'm like, what am I going to do? It's Friday night, and I have a temple shift in the morning. And I ended up going to my temple shift the next day. And I remember driving, and it just felt dark. It just felt like, I'm so grateful that all of these blessings have come to me, but I am lonely, and I don't want to do this life anymore. At this point, I'm like, I've got my kids safe. I can move on. Like, I can just move on to my next life. I'm good. And in one of my shifts in the temple, I was taking the recommends. And so there was a lull, and I pulled out my scriptures, and I just opened it thinking, is there anything that the Lord could say to me? And I happened to open to 4th Nephi 1:11, which was the first verse on the upper left-hand corner. And it says, and they were married and given in marriage, and were blessed according to the multitude of promises which the Lord had made unto them. And I thought, are you kidding? And I closed it, and I put it away. And I'm like, I don't know. I didn't feel like, I just felt like, and by this time, like, it's the beginning, we're moving into the beginning of June. And I was done. That July 30th, 2023 had for me become a death date of that dream. It was the ending. I'm like, this is all I have. I'll give it to you till July 30th, and that's it. And less than 2 weeks later, I got a message on LDS Singles, which I didn't think, that's a whole story in itself. But I ended up connecting with this guy named Matt. He lived on the other side of the state. And he came to see me before I was heading to Arizona. So I was supposed to be going to Arizona for my full trial. But at this point, we had come to a settlement. And so I was just going to sign papers and see my family and friends. And actually, I connected with you. You flew in there during that time. It was supposed to be for my trial, and then it just ended up being a celebration. And Matt came to see me before I left, which I later learned was because I was going to be gone for 2 weeks, and he didn't want to waste his time if there wasn't going to be anything there. But by the time he came and visited for just a couple of hours, and within a few weeks, we were engaged. And he knew that I had written a relationship vision. He knew what I was doing for my work at the time, but I did not share with him the date of it because I didn't want any weirdness. And with timing and going to visit my family, we ended up getting married on July 29th, 2023. So on July 31st, 2023, I'm sorry, I think I said 30th, but it's July 31st was the day. It was the last day of July. So on July 31st, I was in Arizona in a hotel room the day before we were going back home after getting married. And so when I read, I'm so happy and grateful that I am in a healthy marriage relationship, I was actually in a healthy marriage relationship. And we were married in Arizona, and then we've been sealed in December of that same year. So last year we were sealed in December 30th, and it couldn't, like, I don't know that there could be anything more perfect in a relationship than what we have. And to think that 10 years ago, the best I had was to let myself wake up, to now, I love waking up. I'm tired still. I don't think that's going to go away. I've decided that when you are really invested in doing the Lord's work, I think the tired just gets to hang around till we get breaks here and there. But I know other people that go through similar experiences, and I wouldn't do it any other way except for holding on to my covenants. It's the only thing it's what kept me going. It's what I felt I could depend on when nothing else in the world felt dependable.
I just love all of this. And, I'm curious with your decision to be an ordinance worker and not being denied. Do you attribute that to these miracles?
I absolutely did. I do. Yeah.
We just never know. When I 6 years ago, just a personal note here, like I had decided a year before, we lived in Castle Del, so it was a 2-hour drive to the temple. And I just remember thinking before I moved up here that year, I'm like, I'm just going to go to the temple once a week. So I'm seeing these parallels between your story and my story. And it was a sacrifice, right? But that's one of the covenants anyway. But it was a sacrifice, but you felt, at least for me, I just felt like that's what I needed to do, to have that lifeline of hope. And no, I didn't, I just knew that's just what my next step was. But when I moved up here, I'm living in Murray, so the Salt Lake Temple is my district. But I'm like, no, Draper's my favorite. I want to go work in the Draper Temple. And I went and asked them if I could work in the Draper Temple, and they said, no, we don't do that. And I'm like, my stubborn streak, just like, nope, I guess I'm just not going to work in the temple. that's just how I was. I don't know. So it took me another 5 years. Here it is in February, just of 2024, and I'm sitting in a state conference, and some guy was just talking. He was a bishop in one of the wards in our stake, and he just said, if you've ever thought about working in the temple, you need to just do it. Well, my husband was the bishop, and so I just leaned over. I'm like, okay, sign me up. And by that next 2 days later, I'm in having an interview and whatnot. But there's a setting apart that happens as an ordinance worker. And specifically, the part of that blessing that I remember was my children will be blessed for my service in the temple. And I didn't know what that was. And I didn't really expect anything. It was just a nice promise, and however the Lord wants to grant that. And it was like 6 weeks later, where my oldest daughter, who'd been struggling with postpartum depression, and there has just been a lot of struggle, she came to me and she says, Mom, my depression started going away, and I attribute it to you working in the temple. You just don't know what those blessings are going to be. And I'm so glad that Jesus didn't deny me either the opportunity to work in the temple and whatever we're feeling inspired to do. So we appreciate, Bethany, you sharing your stories and just being vulnerable and open with us. And, there are challenges. We live in this fallen world, right? But we have our covenants to hold on to. And however, whether it's hope for the lifeline or whatever the blessing is that God wants to grant us, we're open to any of that. So with all of this being said and done, and you share these beautiful stories and you've had these experiences, and here you are in a beautiful, healthy relationship, why do you today, 2024, why do you stay in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints?
It's actually an easy answer, because, and it was made easy for me because I grew up with a mom that drilled into me the gospel of Jesus Christ is perfect, the people are not. And I've had to wonder, what experiences did she have that she said that to me so many times? What did she experience that she needed to, that she knew so strongly that the gospel of Jesus Christ is perfect when the people are not. Because I have had some pretty poor experiences with leadership and things that I've been questioned. Why did you stay in the church if X, Y, and Z happened? And because for me, it felt scarier outside of my covenants than within them. And so it's through that teaching from my mom that I've been able to see beyond the culture, which in my mind has become toxic in some ways. The culture, I'm not talking about the gospel, but the culture that we'll sit in. Learning and understanding that the gospel is of Jesus Christ is perfect keeps me rooted in the eternal principles and the doctrine that has nothing to do with the culture that is there. And then I just hold on to the knowledge and the comfort that at the end of the day, Jesus is the chief judge. He's the one that's going to decide. And he wants me in God's kingdom. That's where he wants me. And so he's the only one that I need to be worried about. I don't need to be worried if my bishop likes me or not, which not that I've only had one time that my bishop really didn't like me, and it was a struggle, but the only thing that matters is what my Savior thinks of me. And I don't think that I've ever questioned. I've had periods of inactivity, but it had nothing to do, it was my depression. I didn't know how to get out of bed. I was inactive from life, not just from church. Like, it wasn't a church thing, it was a life thing. So I stay because the gospel is perfect.
Beautiful. Sorry, my mute button wouldn't come off. Was there something more that you'd wanted to say about the nethermost parts of the vineyard?
Oh, yes. So just before I met Matt, I had been led to Jacob chapter 5. Like, I felt the Spirit taking me to Jacob chapter 5, and I felt like I kept trying to leave the chapter, and I'm like, I don't know. So I just kept getting nugget after nugget. But one of the verses in there is when the servant says to the Lord, why did you have me plant out here? And the Lord says, do not question me. I have, for a long time, I have prepared this spot of land and it will bear forth fruit. And so what I was reading in that at the time is I thought, oh, I'm being given permission to date people that aren't members of the church because I'm not having any luck with the members of the church. So I truly felt like I would be able to find somebody. And I really felt like if they were going to treat me well and treat my children well, I mean, I've had 2 failed temple marriages. So for me, that wasn't, not that it's not a priority, but I'm like, that's not the be all and end all anymore. You know, that temple marriage. So it was really the relationship piece. And I felt like the Lord was telling me that it was okay, and to understand, like, and to be aware that that he had been nourishing something before I could see it. And but then I met Matt, and that, you know, that didn't fit. It was fine. That was just a lesson I had learned several weeks before meeting Matt. But then we got engaged, and there was one thing that was for me a deal breaker. If I was going to be dating a member of the church, I needed him attending the temple before we met, because I didn't want to feel like they were going to go to the temple for me. That didn't work so well in my first 2 marriages, and it led to animosity and contention. And so when I found that that wasn't happening, not for any other reason than it just wasn't happening, that was a deal breaker. Like, that was like a deal breaker. I only had one deal breaker, and that was it. And I remember, like, I've got this ring on my finger and I love this person, but the terror of feeling I don't ever want to go through what I went through before. I've been married in the temple. I didn't want to go through that again. And I can remember just standing there and looking at him, and I had the words enter my head, Bethany, Jacob, chapter 5. I knew this. And that idea of the nethermost parts of the land being nourished is what prepared me for when I was presented with my deal breaker, which I feel was an honorable deal breaker. It was for the right reasons. And now we attend the temple every week. And if I forget, he's the one that's like, hey, it's time to go back to the temple. And our temple's here been closed for 2 weeks, and we had gone on a cruise before then. So we haven't been in like 4 weeks, and we're both feeling it. And we can't wait to get back tomorrow. Finally opened. It opens tomorrow. So That was where that came in, is being taught that by the Spirit, so that when I was presented with a situation, I had already been prepared for it. There was no more question.
I love that you have this whole experience that of recognizing that he was going to the nethermost parts of the vineyard to prepare the soil and prepare and nourish and so forth, and all of the preparation that because you were keeping your covenants, because you chose him, because you were willing to even say, yes, I will still do and serve you, even when I'm mad at you, even when I'm questioning and so forth. And it shows you how well he knows you to have said that to you, said, hey, I understand you're mad. That's fine. Will you still serve me? But because you were willing to keep those covenants, the Lord was able to provide an honorable man for you, for your children. And now you have been the happiest you've been over the last year since you've married Matt. And things have just come together so beautifully. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us.
Thank you.
And thank you to our listeners who have spent this hour with us hearing Bethany's story. If you have a story of your own, we invite you to email us at anchoredinChristpodcast@gmail.com and let us know that you have a story, and we can set something up to interview you and share that with the world and share your light. Also share this podcast with friends. If it resonates with you and you know it might resonate with a friend, send this to them. We would love your subscriptions to our podcast and to our YouTube channel. We just appreciate the love.